Winter in Upper Silesia. The wind sweeps across the plain of Birkenau and slips between poorly nailed boards, as if searching for cracks where it can do harm. In the roll call line, the women stand motionless for hours, their feet sunk into frozen mud. Searchlights rake the camp, dogs strain against their leashes, and a short, sharp order cuts through the air in German. No one moves more than necessary, because every gesture can become a pretext. In that landscape of towers, wire, and chimneys, daily life is reduced to a rigid sequence. Waking before dawn, formation, work, a blow, hunger, formation again, back to the block. The body learns to conserve energy, the mind learns not to ask. And yet there is one process, no discipline and no silence can escape: pregnancy. In the Nazi camps, a pregnant woman was not seen as someone who needed care. She was seen as an operational problem, a body that, for the system, had ceased to be useful. A burden that could not march at the rhythm of labor, that could fall ill, and that also carried with it something the camp would not tolerate. A child who could not obey, could not produce, could not be lined up in a row. Many women arrived already pregnant, without anyone knowing during the journey. Others became pregnant after weeks or months of confinement, sometimes through clandestine bonds, sometimes through abuse, sometimes through the violence that accompanied slavery. For all of them, pregnancy opened a race against time. If the belly was detected, selection could come. If the birth happened, a patrol could come. And if the baby cried, the end could come. There were camps where pregnancy was resolved, with an immediate decision on the arrival ramp. There were others where forced abortions were imposed to send the woman back to work. There were places where the newborn was killed within minutes, and places where it survived for a few days, sustained by clandestine networks of prisoners who shared rags, crumbs, and watchfulness. In every case, birth did not mean a normal beginning. It meant exposure. And even so, the system had to contend with a reality it could not erase completely. In barracks without hot water, in infirmaries where the word hospital had no meaning, and on evacuation marches where mud mixed with blood, children were born. Some died before receiving a name. Some were separated from their mothers and lost their identity in distant offices, and a few reached the day of liberation alive, becoming a detail impossible to ignore. What happened to the children born in the camps was, almost always, a story of decisions made over other bodies. Decisions that varied with the year, the place, the type of camp, and the desperation of the war's final months. But the overall pattern repeated itself. Pregnancy was pursued, childbirth was a risk, and the newborn was treated as an error that had to disappear or be appropriated. That was the invisible map of birth under the Third Reich. Not a map of cradles, but of lists, selections, infirmaries, and barracks. And on that map, every cry became the camp's most dangerous sound, born under barbed wire. In the regime's early years, before the war spread across the continent, the camps functioned as a tool of internal repression. Dachau opened in March 1933, and over time other centers followed, where punishment was combined with forced labor. Most prisoners were men, and the female presence, though real, was subject to specific controls. In that stage, pregnancy could occur, but it was not a central phenomenon in camp administration, because the system had not yet reached the industrial scale it would later acquire. Everything changed with the war. From 1939 onward, the occupation of territories and systematic persecution multiplied the number of detained women. The concentration camp universe became a structure of classification: transit, labor, punishment, extermination. Within that framework, a woman's fate began to be decided through a procedure that would be repeated thousands of times: arrival by train, the ramp, and selection. In extermination centers, selection followed a direct logic. Those not considered fit to work, including small children, the elderly, and most pregnant women, were killed immediately. In labor camps and industrial complexes, the logic was different but no safer. There, manpower was needed, and pregnancy became an obstacle that had to be removed. The objective was to return the prisoner to productivity, or discard her once she was no longer useful. The camp administration did not view gestation as a natural biological process. It saw it as a disruption of order. In a system built on lines, quotas, and punishments, a body moving toward childbirth introduced variables: less strength in the quarry or the workshop, more absences due to illness, a higher risk of complications, and one more mouth to feed, however small. That is why, in many places, pregnancy became a condition to be hunted down, and motherhood a threat to discipline and production. The first mechanism of control was detection. The guards watched. The capos pointed. The Revier's records noted. Some women were discovered by the way they walked, by a loss of balance, by vomiting, by an abdomen that could no longer be hidden. Others were denounced because of rivalries within the barrack itself, because the system sowed distrust among prisoners. Once the pregnancy was confirmed, the most dangerous phase began. In many camps, the infirmary acted as a filter. Its function was not to heal, but to decide. There, work reassignments, punishments, transfers, and selections were determined. A pregnant woman could be sent for a forced abortion. Sometimes the procedure was carried out violently and without hygienic conditions. In other cases, medications, injections, or rushed interventions were imposed with a single goal: to end the pregnancy. For the woman, that could mean hemorrhage, infection, and, in many cases, death. Pregnancy was not always detected in time. In an overcrowded camp, with bodies reduced by hunger, many women managed to conceal a pregnancy for weeks. Malnutrition disrupted cycles, and the general loss of weight sometimes delayed physical evidence. That allowed some to reach the end of pregnancy without the administration recording it. And then the second major scenario appeared: the clandestine birth. A birth in a camp did not take place in a clean room. It happened in a corner, behind a blanket hung like a screen, on filthy ground, with a bucket for blood and water, and with rags that had been used again and again. The prisoners who helped were sometimes nurses or midwives before the war. Others had experience only from having attended births in their own families. But they all shared the same understanding: time was minimal and sound was deadly. The cry of a newborn was an immediate risk. In a barrack of hundreds of women, any different sound stood out. A guard could enter on suspicion. A capo could denounce to avoid collective punishment. An inspection could end with the baby being killed and, at times, with the mother's death or transfer. For that reason, births were carried out at night or in moments of chaos, when a shift change, a distant bombing, or an alarm diverted surveillance. If the baby was born alive, the next stage was surviving the first day. The mother tried to breastfeed, but malnutrition meant many produced no milk or too little. Then a network of help appeared: a wet nurse, a woman who still had milk because she had given birth earlier, or a prisoner who saved part of her ration for the mother. Every drop mattered. Sometimes liquids were improvised with dirty water and scraps of bread. Sometimes a sip of broth was obtained not through abundance, but through exchange, risk, and opportunity. But even when food appeared, the other enemy remained: cold. In winter, the barracks were boxes of frozen air. There was not enough heating, and clothing was insufficient. A newborn, without reserves, could slip into hypothermia within hours. So the prisoners improvised warmth with their own bodies, pressing the infant to the chest, wrapping it in layers of rags, hiding it under shared blankets. It was a precarious defense in an environment designed for the body to shut down. To that cold was added the absence of hygiene. Infections of the navel, skin, and respiratory tract were common. Without antibiotics, without clean water, without soap, a minimal lesion could become septicemia. Diarrhea, common because of contaminated water, could kill quickly. In this way, a baby could die without anyone touching it with direct violence. It died by the architecture of hunger, cold, and filth. Beyond medical detection, there was a danger that left almost no trace in the records: sexual violence. The camp structure placed prisoner women under the total control of guards and of a capo system. In some places, that situation led to direct abuse. In others, the system itself organized exploitation through camp brothels, where certain prisoners were forced to serve selected men. For the administration, this was presented as a reward or an incentive, but in practice, it was coercion sustained by threat. A pregnancy born of that violence could make a prisoner an immediate target. When a prisoner became pregnant through abuse or organized exploitation, the risk multiplied. There were reasons to remain silent. Punishment could fall on her, and pregnancy could accelerate selection. But sooner or later, the body could betray her. Then the camp applied its logic. If it was an extermination center, killing was likely and swift. If it was a labor camp, terminating the pregnancy was imposed to return the body to production. In both scenarios, the child was trapped in a fate defined by others. As the system expanded, there were zones where, for administrative or propaganda reasons, family groups were kept together for a limited time. In Birkenau, there was a sector where Romani families were interned without the usual separation by sex and age. There were children, the elderly, and pregnant women. There were births. The existence of that sector was not a humanitarian exception. It was a form of concentration under control, and it ended in mass liquidation when the administration decided to close that chapter. There were also transports and sectors where the regime temporarily retained families for bureaucratic reasons, for exchange calculations, or for propaganda purposes. In those cases, the presence of children and pregnant women could last weeks or months before a new selection. For mothers, that interval was not safety, it was uncertainty. Every roll call could be the last. Every night, transfer could mean disappearance, and pregnancy, in that context, became a marker that brought the decisive moment closer. Inside the barracks, the logic repeated itself in cold words. If a woman was pregnant and the camp needed her working, she had to solve the pregnancy. If the pregnancy advanced and birth was inevitable, the camp had to solve the baby. That euphemism hid different methods. Sometimes a forced abortion, sometimes a violent intervention, sometimes a quick death to avoid noise and disorder, sometimes deliberate neglect until the body stopped breathing, and sometimes separation followed by administrative erasure. There was also a less visible mechanism, structural pressure to ensure the pregnancy did not reach term. In workshops and quarries, women worked under loads, cold, blows, and schedules that broke the body. Many pregnancies ended in spontaneous loss because the organism could not sustain development. In a camp, that outcome was interpreted as an operational relief. The woman returned to the production line. The pain went unrecorded, and the administration kept adding work figures. When birth occurred, and the baby survived a few hours, another problem emerged. The mother had to return to work. In a system where any absence could mean punishment, recovery time barely existed. Some women were forced to appear at formation a few days later, even with fever or hemorrhage. Then the baby was left in the care of other prisoners, if the bloc accepted that risk. Sometimes an elderly woman or a prisoner nurse became an improvised caregiver. Other times, the baby simply had no hands available and died without direct intervention. The camp also punished motherhood as a bond. In many places, the simple act of protecting a baby could be interpreted as a challenge to discipline. The administration sought to break relationships because relationships created loyalties other than obedience. For that reason, even when a child was alive, the system could intervene to separate them. Separation was punishment and at the same time control. A mother who lost her child became more vulnerable. A baby without a mother was defenseless. In Ravensbrück, the largest camp designed primarily for women, pregnancy became a constant issue as the place expanded. Ravensbrück, near Fürstenberg, began as a women's detention center and ended up as a platform for slave labor tied to workshops and companies demanding production. Women from resistance movements arrived there, political opponents, prisoners classified as asocial, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Roma, and mothers separated from their children. In that environment, pregnancy was a dangerous interruption in the circuit of work and discipline. In certain periods, a pregnant woman in Ravensbrück was selected and killed. In others, she was sent to the infirmary to terminate the pregnancy and be returned to work. The logic was utilitarian. A prisoner's value lay in her ability to produce, and pregnancy interrupted that function. As the camp filled up and control grew harsher, exemplary punishment also appeared. A pregnant woman could be treated as an infraction and turned into a warning for the rest of the bloc. In 1944, as the war entered its phase of collapse, Ravensbrück received waves of prisoners evacuated from sub-camps and from regions where the front was approaching. The camp overflowed. Barracks designed for a limited number filled with bodies. Food was reduced. Epidemics spread. In that chaos, visible pregnancies increased, and births increased. Spaces for mothers and babies were improvised, but they were not maternity wards. They were segregation areas where the weakest were concentrated, and where the baby was exposed to cold and illness without resources. In Auschwitz, the problem of birth was visible from the first minute. The complex functioned as a multiple system: administration, punishment, extermination, and industrial labor. In Birkenau, the arrival ramp was the great filter. Trains opened, columns formed, and a selection separated bodies in seconds. SS doctors decided with a gesture who entered the labor circuit and who disappeared. In that procedure, a pregnant woman was considered, almost always, expendable and therefore destined for immediate killing. But Auschwitz was not static. Its rules were adjusted for bureaucratic reasons, for the need for labor, and for the military pressure of the war's final phase. Those adjustments opened contradictory situations: women who managed to hide pregnancy to the limit, births that occurred within the women's sector, and, in some cases, attempts by the administration to manage what it could no longer prevent without creating internal chaos. Accounts by prisoner midwives describe an environment in which childbirth became a procedure for survival. There was no anesthesia, there were no sterile supplies. Sometimes there was not even enough water to clean. The cord was cut with an improvised object and tied with thread pulled from clothing. The newborn was wrapped in damp rags. The mother tried not to scream. At the same time, someone watched the barrack door, because a guard could appear due to a noise, a round, or any excuse. The presence of prisoner midwives did not mean protection for the baby. It meant the camp needed someone to handle the process so the block would not be disrupted. In later testimonies, a repeated detail appears. The life of the newborn could depend on one specific person entering the barrack. Sometimes, it was a guard who decided to kill the baby to avoid disciplinary complications. Sometimes it was a prisoner from the Revier who tried to hide it at the very moment of an unexpected inspection. Within that universe, the name Stanisława Leszczyńska is often cited, a Polish midwife deported to Auschwitz who left an account of births attended under coercion. Her testimony describes the total lack of resources, malnourished women giving birth, and the fate of many newborns who died within hours or days from cold, infection, or hunger, even when no one touched them. That kind of account shows the system's mechanics. Birth was absorbed into a structure not designed to allow a baby to exist. Auschwitz also displayed the logic of separation. When the regime decided a child could be Germanized, the operation followed an administrative sequence. The mother lost the baby without clear explanations. The child was registered under another name or a number unrelated to its origin. Then came transfer to an institution, a home, or a family chosen by the system. That circuit could pass through offices tied to the Reich's racial policy and through networks of institutions, homes, and officials who rewrote the child's identity. When the baby was not appropriated but the camp tolerated it for a brief period, everything depended on an impossible logistics. It had to be hidden during inspections, warmth had to be obtained, infections had to be avoided, the mother had to be sustained long enough to produce milk, and secrecy had to be maintained inside the barrack, in an environment where fear turned information into a weapon. In Auschwitz, the first was also a space associated with medical experiments on women, where reproduction was treated as an object of intervention. There, SS doctors, such as Karl Klauberg, carried out forced sterilization experiments, and other procedures sought to control the capacity to have children in populations deemed undesirable. For a prisoner, that meant the body could become laboratory material under coercion. Motherhood, in that context, added risk. A pregnancy could accelerate selection, open the door to violent interventions, and weaken the mother's body even further. That combination of selection, clandestine birth, killing, separation, and experimentation explains why newborns were so rare in the complex's records. Each time a child was born there, the system reacted with an immediate decision: erase it, appropriate it, or let the environment kill it. Control over reproduction did not stop at childbirth. In different parts of the system, forced sterilizations and experiments were carried out to control the ability to have children. Methods were tested to sterilize on a mass scale, to intervene in the female body, and to cut off the possibility of motherhood. These procedures could leave infections, hemorrhages, chronic pain, and infertility. For a prisoner, surviving the camp did not mean regaining the body as it had been before. The war's end added an even crueler scenario: evacuations. As fronts approached, the administrations of many camps forced prisoners to march into the interior of Germany. These marches, known as death marches, were routes of hunger, cold, and gunfire. In that context, pregnant women were forced to walk. Some gave birth on the road in ditches, in empty barns, in sheds, or at the edge of a highway. A birth on a march was a birth without the possibility of rest. If the column moved, the mother had to get up or be left behind, and being left behind could mean execution. Evacuation also happened by train, sealed cars, overcrowded, with scarce air. There were births there too. Giving birth in a car with no space was a scene of absolute desperation. Blood mixed with the filthy floor, and the baby, if born alive, faced an environment where breathing was difficult. If the train stopped, a patrol could enter. If it continued, the mother was trapped with a newborn in a space without water. Mortality was almost inevitable. The difference lay in how long it took. Not all births occurred in the same type of camp. There were ghetto camps and transit camps where daily life was different, even if the final threat remained deportation. In places like Theresienstadt, for example, there were pregnancies and births, but continuity was fragile. Deportation to Auschwitz or other destinations could interrupt everything at any moment. A baby born in a ghetto camp could be transported and vanish in the next selection. Birth there did not guarantee survival. It only opened another stretch of uncertainty. When the Soviet army entered Auschwitz in January 1945, it found thousands of survivors too weak to have been evacuated. Among them were children, but most were adolescents or minors who had survived through labor selection or particular circumstances. Newborns were extremely rare. And yet the end of the conflict left images and records of babies in some liberated camps, especially in those where collapse had prevented the usual procedures from being carried out as quickly. Bergen-Belsen is the example of collapse turned into death. The camp, not designed as an extermination center with gas chambers, became a funnel for evacuations. By early 1945, overcrowding was extreme. Epidemics spread. Water was scarce. Corpses accumulated. In that environment, there were pregnant women and births. The scene was one of birth surrounded by disease. The mother gave birth weakened. The baby was born without defenses. And survival depended on a minimal combination of warmth, water, and food that was almost never available. After liberation, the newborn survival became a medical emergency. Military teams and volunteers faced a population with severe malnutrition and contagious diseases. Feeding a baby under those conditions was not simple. Milk was limited. Contact with the sick was constant. Hygiene was insufficient. Children's areas were improvised in buildings inside the camp itself or in nearby facilities. Efforts were made to reorganize food and water so the child would not die in the first month of freedom. For the children who survived, another problem emerged: identity. A baby born in a camp might have no documents. It might have no family. The mother might have died in the last weeks or be so ill she could not care for it. Some were registered as child without identity or child of an unknown prisoner because no one had complete information. Others carried names given by other prisoners because the original name was lost in transit. In some cases, a child grew up with an incomplete story and only decades later could reconstruct it. The fate of the appropriated children was even more complex. Germanization meant transferring certain minors to homes, institutions, or German families, changing their names and cutting the bond with their origins. Recovering those identities took decades. There were sealed archives, destroyed documents, changes of address, and a simple reality: the child grew up as someone else. When, years later, attempts were made to reverse the process, identity had already been shaped by another life. For mothers who survived, reunion was a rare possibility, and sometimes it came only when the child was already an adult. In post-war testimonies, many women remembered birth in the camp as a concrete, almost mechanical sequence. Memory clung to details in order not to break apart: the sound of a metal bucket, the cold of the floor, the rag that became a diaper, the desperate search for water, a companion's vigilance to warn if a guard approached, the feeling that every minute was borrowed. Those details show that birth, even when it happened, remained trapped within the logic of confinement. The reason so many newborns died was not a single one. It was a set of accumulated factors. The mother arrived weakened by deportation. She lived on rations calculated to destroy the body. She worked long days. She slept in overcrowding. She had no vitamins and no rest. Birth happened without hygiene. The baby was born underweight. Breastfeeding was insufficient. Exposure to cold and disease completed the circle. Even without an explicit order to kill, the system was built so that life could not be sustained. And even when there was an order, the method could vary. Sometimes it was direct and swift killing, sometimes forced abortion, sometimes separation, and sometimes a form of organized abandonment, letting the body go out without intervention, because the environment was already doing the work. That variation did not change the overall outcome. What changed was the appearance of the procedure. Between the detection of pregnancy and the newborn's fate lay a span of time that could be weeks or only hours, and in that span, a constant tension concentrated. First came concealment. In the barracks, where every body was watched, a pregnant woman tried to look like any other prisoner, to walk without slowing, not to bring a hand to her belly, not to stop in line, not to ask for water. If her clothes were too large, they could betray her. If too tight, they could too. Then, simple, dangerous strategies appeared. Standing in the middle of the formation, finding tall companions on either side, bending when passing near a guard, or using layers of clothing to disguise the contour. Then came control through work. In a camp, work was not only exploitation, it was surveillance. The prisoner had to report to roll call, receive an order, and move with her group. If she did not perform, punishment followed. A pregnant woman tried to remain in less physical tasks, but those were assigned arbitrarily and through internal hierarchies. When fatigue showed, risks multiplied. A blow in the workshop, a fall in the mud, a fever misread as an excuse for sanction, or the simple decision to send her to the infirmary to check her. As pregnancy advanced, the third problem was the body itself. Hunger altered everything. Many women could not gain weight. Others swelled with edema. Others spent days with diarrhea or fever. That could hide pregnancy from a guard's eyes, but it also weakened the fetus. That is why, even when birth came, the baby could be born underweight and struggling to breathe. And the camp offered no environment to stabilize it. What a clinic resolved with warmth, hygiene, and medical supervision depended there on rags, body heat, and luck. Then came the moment of birth. In a hospital, birth is a long, controlled process. In a camp, it was an emergency that had to end quickly and silently. The prisoner midwife, if present, improvised. Hot water, if available, was a rare luxury. A clean blade was an exception. Sometimes a metal object was boiled to cut the cord. Sometimes a strip of cloth served as a tie. And always there was the same concern, that no one outside the block would hear. If the baby was born alive, time became an enemy. In the first hours, warmth was sought. 2 or 3 women took turns keeping it pressed to a chest, because the barrack air could kill it. Then food was sought. If the mother had no milk, help was sought from another woman, or bread was soaked in water so the mother could swallow and produce something. It was an economy of drops. The baby, however, did not require great blows to die. One cold night was enough, a navel infection, or diarrhea that dehydrated within hours. And even when the baby did not die in those hours, the next reality appeared. The block was not a private space. There were roll calls, inspections, collective punishments, and movements of prisoners. At every roll call, the child could be seen. At every inspection, it could be heard. At every transfer, the mother could be separated. For that reason, some women tried to hide the baby during roll call, between boards or under straw, and took it out only when the door closed again. That practice had a price. The baby was without warmth for critical minutes, and the risk of suffocation or hypothermia multiplied. Intervention, when it came, could be direct or indirect. Direct, when a guard or superior ordered the baby to be finished off on the spot. Indirect, when the mother was moved to another section, or the baby was taken and she was forced back to work. In that second case, the baby was left in the hands of other prisoners or the infirmary, where the lack of resources led it to die anyway. The mother was required to continue as if nothing had happened. And if she collapsed from fever or hemorrhage, she was exposed to later selection. That span also explains why many births left no record. The camp recorded what mattered to it: arrivals, numbers, transfers, deaths by category. A clandestine baby did not fit that accounting. If it died quickly, it disappeared without paper. If it was appropriated, its identity was written elsewhere, under another name. And if, exceptionally, it survived to liberation, its existence might appear in improvised lists from military hospitals or aid organizations, not in the camp's internal documents. So when answering what happened to the children born in the camps, the general sequence remains. First, concealment. The mother tries to hide the pregnancy. Then discovery or the clandestine birth. Next, the system's intervention, forced abortion, selection, the killing of the newborn, or separation. And finally, if the child survived for a time, the struggle against hunger, cold, and disease, until liberation, in very rare cases, arrived before the body went out. That path explains why children born in camps are so few in the records, and, at the same time, why their stories carry particular weight. A birth, in that context, did not represent normality. It represented a collision between biology and administration, and in that collision, administration almost always won. And still, some women managed to leave a trace. Some preserved an exact date, a name, a city of origin. Others could preserve only a mental image. But those memories, gathered after the war, made it possible to reconstruct a fact the regime had tried to erase, that even there, even at the core of a system designed to deny a future, children were born. And when a liberation photograph appears showing a baby wrapped in a rag, held by a woman whose face is hollowed by hunger, the historical meaning of that detail becomes clear. Not because birth changed the system, but because it exposed it. In a camp, a baby was not tolerated, and yet it existed. And its mere existence forced guards and administrators, again and again, to decide how to erase what had just been born. After liberation, the lives of those children were not resolved simply because the gates opened. In improvised military hospitals and in displaced persons camps, many newborns and infants became dependent on relief organizations. Milk, clothing, and a place to isolate them from epidemics had to be found. Their existence also had to be formally registered, because without papers, a child could easily be lost in the flow of evacuations, repatriations, and resettlements. For the mothers who survived, the problem was double. First, regaining strength to care for them. Second, proving who they were. Some no longer had a usable surname in daily practice, because the camp had reduced their identity to a number and a category. In those cases, recognition depended on witnesses, other prisoners who could confirm a pregnancy, an approximate date, and a birth in a particular block. When that testimony was missing, the child remained without confirmed origin, and the search could last for years. Sometimes only a date and one more name remained. In the end, the fate of those children split into three trajectories. The first, the most common, was immediate or early death, through direct violence or through abandonment within an environment designed to kill. The second was separation and erasure, when the child was appropriated and its identity rewritten. The third, the rarest, was survival until liberation and the beginning of a life in a world that had to reconstruct names, origins, and families. That is the story of the children born in the camps. A story of births without a cradle, identities without paper, and small bodies facing a machinery that was not built to leave them room.